If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep the show going, there's a few things you could do to help me out. You could go to my website, andyhedges.com, and make a donation to the show. Or you could go to the iTunes store and leave me a review and a 5-star rating. And you could also go to my website and buy a album or a t-shirt, and while you're there, you could sign up for my email newsletter. I'd like to start today's show with a poem written by an old-time poet named Captain Jack Crawford. Captain Jack Crawford was known as the Poet Scout, and he was a friend of Buffalo Bill Cody's and was also a performer in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. This poem is from 1910, and it's entitled The Bronco. I am saddest when I'm gladdest, and I'm gladdest when I'm sad. I am maddest when I'm baddest, and I'm baddest when I'm mad. But my sadness and my badness with my madness all combine just to fertilize the gladness in this bronco soul of mine. I would rather be a bronco with a lightning disposition than a goody-goody smooth one who for suckers goes a-fishing, for the bronco shows his colors and he reaches out behind him, and you know just what's a-comin' when you undertake to bind him. He is not a-goin' to stand for to be roped and throwed and bottled, to be bridled, cinched, and saddled, and unmercifully throttled, and he'll buck and kick like blazes just for all that there is to him. You may break his heart and kill him, but you never can subdue him. What's the reason, do you ask me? Ask the chump as does the ropin'. He'll admit a pound of sugar's worth 100 pounds of dopin', and it's well the bronco knows it, and resents it when you bleed him. But with smiles and lumps of sugar, why, a little child can lead him. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Michael Martin Murphey. Michael Martin Murphey is a singer and a songwriter and the creator of the Western Cultural Festival called Westfest. Murphy was passing through Lubbock a few days ago, and we sat down in a hotel room right off the freeway and recorded this interview. I asked Murphy to talk about the history of Westfest and the inspiration he's found in the life of Buffalo Bill. Here's Michael Martin Murphey.
Well, first of all, Westfest has been the defining moment in my career as far as a performance goes. The things that happened as a result of Westfest happening totally changed my whole life, creatively, direction-wise, culturally, and everything. And that happened because of the Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko. I went to the second Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko. Not the first one. I missed the first one. The artist and painter William C. Matthews, who we in this world refer to as Willie, who made so many posters for the Cowboy Poetry Gathering over the years and did my first album covers, including Geronimo's Cadillac and all the Cowboy Songs album covers in the beginning, called me up and said, there's this event you got to go to called Cowboy Poetry Gathering, and you got to make it. I went out there and saw that I had a lot of fellow feeling with the kind of people that were attending that event. Only 300 people attended it the first year. I think the second year, 3,000 people attended it because it got on the cover of Time magazine. I met Don Edwards there. I met Waddy Mitchell there. And I met so many others. And I was inspired to put together something that was a musical version of the Cowboy Poetry Gathering. They didn't have that much music in the gathering in the beginning, just very little. As a matter of fact, I had to be invited on stage to play guitar that year because they hadn't scheduled any music. We just had poets sitting around what was kind of a faux campfire on stage reciting poetry for the first few years. And they asked me to come on stage. I played Spanish is a Loving Tongue, Border Affair by Badger Clark, and a couple other songs. And the audience loved it. And Hal told me, he's the founder of the Cowboy Poetry Gathering, Hal Cannon, said, Murph, you've given me the idea that we need to have some music in this event too. And not just a bunch of folklorists singing music, but anybody who's interested in cowboy music. So he invited me back for the next year. Meanwhile, I went back to Colorado that winter, and I was living in New Mexico, but I was in Colorado. I had been approached by Copper Mountain Resort to put on a festival up there. I had been a part of the previous summer an event called the Country Fair, and what they were trying to do is catch up with Telluride and Winter Park and all the other places that were putting on festivals. But these guys were putting on jazz festivals and rock festivals and stuff. And country festivals too, in terms of Telluride country. They said, but it failed. It fell on its face. It was a flat failure. So Copper Mountain people said, right after that event, said, you were the only act that drew any people to the festival, and even that wasn't much. But you've got some real experience in the country music world. Do you think you could help us put together some kind of a festival up here next year? And I said, well, let me think about it. And then I went to the Cowboy Poetry Gathering. And while I was thinking about it, I had also been reading a lot of stuff about Buffalo Bill's Wild West because I'm a fan of what Buffalo Bill did, and I feel like he's the founder of truly Americana show business. It wasn't P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum was imitating circus in Europe. That's another part of the conversation. But I'd been reading that and lots of other Western history. I've done that all my life. I'd been collecting cowboy songs all my life, and my mother in 1985 gave me a book by Jim Bob Tinsley called He Was Singing This Song, which was published by University of Florida Press. Jim Bob was an old member of the Gene Autry Band, but also a professor at a school in Florida and in North Carolina, who was kind of an amateur folklorist and eventually became a professional one. I read that book and looked at the stories of the cowboy songs, and I started putting in cowboy songs in my show. So there's this nexus of things happening going on. I'm thinking over, what should I do? I go back to Copper Mountain after going to the poetry gathering, and I said, there's a revival going on in this country of real cowboy music and real cowboys telling their stories and ranch life. And this is mainly driven by folklorists out in the far west, in Utah, California, and beyond. And it occurs to me that what we need to do is do a country music festival that includes a whole bunch of that kind of stuff in it. If we just throw a bunch of folklore stuff in there, nobody's going to come. But if we invite Vince Gill and Dwight Yoakam and those people, but we also put cowboy poets and cowboy singers on stage in between their concerts, we might just have a unique festival on our hands. Even the Bluegrass Festival in Telluride had come to realize that if they just put a bunch of family bluegrass bands and people from up in the Appalachian Mountains on their show, they weren't going to draw any people. So the Bluegrass Festival had already become an event where James Taylor would come and I would come and Lyle Lovett would come and play along with the bluegrass bands and express our love of bluegrass music. So I said, there is no festival in Colorado that's really celebrating the culture that Colorado comes from and is right in the middle of still today. Culture of the American West. I mean, bluegrass is something that comes from the eastern mountains of our nation. And jazz is something that comes from the West Coast and the East Coast. And blues festivals comes from the Deep South. And rock, arguably comes from someplace else too. You need a festival that's about the culture of the American West. And they said, well, what are we going to call it? I said, well, I got to think about that too. So I came back with the idea of Westfest. It was a catchy phrase. The words West and Fest rhymed. Everybody was into festivals at that time. So I came up with the name Westfest, and they liked it. Then I started looking at trademarks. Everybody said, trademark both Westfest and Michael Martin Murphey's Westfest. And I said, why is that? And they said, well, it's going to take us a long time to do a search on Westfest. And on the chance that we don't get it, which by the way, we eventually did get it, you've got your name attached to it, and that will be a separate kind of trademark. Turned out that was a good decision, because in reading Buffalo Bill's history, I noticed after they made that comment, Buffalo Bill had never said the Wild West show. It was always Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And he never used the word show. You won't find a single poster of that era in which Buffalo Bill ever called it a show. In fact, in an interview in New York, after he'd done several really successful years of Wild West, a reporter asked him, Colonel Cody, why did you go forward with Wild West when, in fact, there are over 100 other shows touring America calling themselves the Wild West show now? He said, well, you may take note that I've never called it a show and never used the word show. It is an exhibition of impressions of real life that I lived on the American prairie as a military scout, as a freighter, as a cowboy, as a buffalo hunter, and an Indian fighter. And that is the basis of my show. It is an exhibition of scenes from my life and my impressions. It is not a show. Don't call me show business. He was very offended by that. And he said, well, what about the idea that there's so many people calling it Wild West show that are running around competing with you? And his press agent broke in. It was a guy named Major Burke. Major Burke was one of the most brilliant press agents in the history of American show business, by the way. He did things that were so far-reaching and so far-thinking ahead that you can't believe it. But he said to the reporter, sir, there may be many Wild West shows and maybe many Wild West exhibitions, but there's only one Buffalo Bill and only one Buffalo Bill's Wild West. So I took a cue from that. I said, well, there's only one Michael Martin Murphey, too. There's only one of all of us. So there's only one me, and there's only one impression of what I want to do. And if this is going to be my festival, then why not put my name on it? And I never did attach the word show to it. I always careful to point out it's an exhibition. We put it on the first year in 1987. And I got on the Johnny Carson show that year. Carson had heard about it and asked me to come on the show. First time I'd ever been on Carson. But I also had just had a hit, a couple of hits in country music and in pop music. So he asked me to come on the show and sing a couple of my hit country songs. And he held up a poster of the event and said, everybody needs to go out and see this. Carson was a big fan of Western stuff. He was also the first guy to put Cowboy Poets on international television. And his show was the biggest show in the world at that time. 40 million people at one time watching. So I go on there, he promotes it, and it's just a runaway hit that first year for Copper Mountain. A runaway hit with 3,000 people, which my partners in the event, who took care of all the fine art exhibition and the arts and crafts part of the event, thought was a low attendance. They were worried about it. They came to me and said, okay, this'll do. The next year it doubled to 6,000, and the next year it doubled again, and the next year it doubled again. We ultimately got up to 40,000 people a show coming to it. And at one time, we exceeded the numbers of the CMA Music Festival in Nashville, called Fanfare at the time, by over 10,000 people. And it was at that point that my record company called me up and said, maybe we really should do an album of cowboy songs, because I'd been on their case about doing it for years, and they wouldn't let me do it. They said, we'll drop you from the label. And they had actually dropped me from the label for a while. But they let me do it in 1989, and that year was the biggest Westfest we ever had that following Labor Day weekend after I released that album. So that's the fast thumbnail sketch of Westfest. Andy, you and I know that history is probably the least popular curriculum item in every school in our nation. And it's really hard to get kids to listen to history. But it's never been that way with me. I have always been absolutely thrilled by history, primarily because my grandfathers and my aunts and uncles and cousins were all ranchers, and they had actually participated in the opening up of Texas. And, you know, they were here right after Texas became a state in 1848. So I heard all those stories about my family coming in here and starting ranches. And then, of course, my uncle, who was a large animal doctor in West Texas, who went to Texas A&M, just loved to tell all those cowboy stories. He was the primary veterinarian for the 4-6s at that time. So I heard all these stories from my grandfathers, from all these people. It was absolutely thrilling to me. I started collecting Western books when I was just barely old enough to read. You know, I got the child's version of Davy Crockett and the child's version of Wyatt Earp, and the child's, you know, they had all these children's books about these people's lives. Of course, they were pretty cleaned up so that, you know, kids could get it and wouldn't be shocked by anything. I delved into it. I started collecting Indian art when I was 12 years old on my first vacation to Grand Canyon when I went to the Hopi Reservation. So I've always been thrilled by history, inspired by history. Then I got into show business, and the history of cowboy songs really drove the way that I did all of my music, because it shaped me, because I wanted to be a poet about my own backyard. I didn't want to be a pop music singer that just wrote songs for the charts. I wanted to be a poet of the Southwest. That's what I went for as a lyricist. And all that old cowboy poetry, all those old cowboy songs, were my absolute intellectual mentors of a form to use of how to tell a story in a song. In doing that, getting into show business, I also began to read about Buffalo Bill. Because I started to think about, what is the foundation of show business in our country? And I thought it was P.T. Barnum. I started reading about P.T. Barnum. I realized he didn't have anything Western in his show. All of a sudden, along comes Buffalo Bill in 1882 and does a show called The Old Glory Blowout, which he was asked to do for the 4th of July by some people in Nebraska because they couldn't think of anything else to celebrate the 4th of July. And 4th of July had become an incredibly important event in our country at that point because Custer was killed in 1876. And that's when it really became a big military celebration, too, about veterans. Regardless of what you think about that conflict and what happened and what side you're on, that's just the way it was. But Cody felt the need, when he put that event together called the Old Glory Blowout, to invite Native Americans who now had made peace in Nebraska with the people involved. So he did something that was absolutely unprecedented and had a big effect on my show later. He invited people that he had fought against on the battlefield to join him in a show. Now think about General Schwarzkopf inviting Saddam Hussein to join him in a traveling show about 10 years after the Iraqi War. That's what Buffalo Bill did. They were that bitter enemies. You know, Native Americans were absolutely hated and reviled by every American at that time, except for a few Indian agents and a few Quakers and a few peacemakers. Most people absolutely feared him or were scared of him and hated him, especially for the massacres that had happened on both sides. Imagine what that took for Cody to say, well, we're going to bring some Indians in here. We're going to let them dance. We're going to even let them reenact the way they rode horses and stuff. Because Cody loved Native Americans. He was really opposed to General Sheridan and some of the other generals, including Grant. I mean, Sheridan denied saying the only good Indian is a dead Indian, ever saying that, but I think he denied it after, it became an egregious thing in his career that he had said that. I don't doubt that he probably said it, and probably a lot of them said it many times. Cody and even Custer were dead set against massacring the Indians. They were the ones who were lobbying for them having a reservation. And it was only at the reluctance of our government that they were even granted reservation status in Indian lands. And Custer, Cody, and several other of those cavalry guys were saying, look, we got to make peace with these people. They're great people. They're a great culture. We came in on orders to take them out, but living out here with them, we've now seen that they've got their side of the story, and they've got a great culture. And after all, we're trying to convert them to be Christians and Americans. Why go massacre them if on the one hand you're saying they have a soul? Well, most people forget that Standing Bear in the late 1880s, I believe early 1890s, was the first Native American to ever be recognized as a human being. I'm not talking about given citizenship. They weren't given citizenship till later. Indians did not have the status of even being recognized as human beings by our culture. Standing Bear in Oklahoma went to the Supreme Court to get that done. He cut open his wrist and let his arms bleed in front of the judges and said, my blood is the same color as yours, Your Honor. We share the same blood. I am a human being. The judge broke down in tears and said, all right, you will now be declared a human being, as will all Native Americans. So what Cody was up against was taking people who were considered subhuman and putting them into a show to celebrate the 4th of July, which is a patriotic event that involves a lot of military veteran recognition. Can you imagine what he was up against? But he got it done. It went over so big that the next year he started his thing called the Wild West in Omaha, Nebraska. And it was a monster success. Thousands of people. And over the period of time that he had the Wild West, which he also took to Europe, probably virtually every man, woman, and child in America that was healthy enough to be able to do it attended that show. It still holds the attendance record for all entertainment shows in the history of the world relative to the population that it played to. In other words, 90 to nearly 100% of the people in America went to see that show at some point, if they were able to get there. Inspired a lot of kids, a lot of young boys to become Westerners. So Cody's methods and ideas, and his press agent and his partner Nate Salisbury's ideas for putting on a piece of Western entertainment. I'll never forget a moment when at Westfest, my uncle attended. He was a Purple Heart recipient in World War II. And I went up and asked the Native Americans there to do what they often do in their powwows. They do honor songs in Indian language. They do honor songs for the Native American veterans, for their veterans. And I asked them if they do one for my uncle. And I got my uncle up on stage, and he's standing there in what remnants of his uniform that he had left from World War II, because they asked him if he would bring his uniform if we did that. He's standing there in what remnants he had left that could fit into. He was still pretty skinny in old age. He's got all his medals on, he's got his Purple Heart on, and they're playing this gigantic war drum, and they're singing this war song, this on for the war heroes, and this war veteran song. I never saw before, and I never saw since, my Uncle Lemoyne buckle to his knees and cry. But he did on that day. He said, Michael, I thought about the Indians that were in that Battle of Omaha Beach, and the black guys that were there, and the Mexican guys that were there. We were heavily prejudiced against them at that time. He said, but I thought about the code talkers and the people that, saved World War II by talking in their own language that the Japanese couldn't decode and some of the other people in Europe couldn't decode. So, those are some of the moments that happened at Westfest that I'll never forget. I'll also never forget the first time I put a cowboy poet, Waddy Mitchell, in front of a group of 3,000 people who were anxious to hear Dwight Yoakam play some, cutting-edge country music at the first event we did. And right before him, it was packed out there. I put this cowboy poet up there to do poetry. He was the MC the first few years. And I said, Waddy, I can't tell you they're going to listen to you. I have no idea what they're going to do. And when he first went up there, started doing some poetry, I go there all saying, "Where's Dwight? Get Dwight!" And I had already covered this. I said, Waddy, if they start doing that, you tell them that Dwight Yoakam asked you to perform, because I had already gone to Dwight and said, Dwight, is this okay? He said, oh yeah, I'm a big fan of cowboy poetry. So he goes up there and says, I want you to know that my friend Dwight Yoakam that you're about to see is coming on in a minute. He's in there getting ready right now, and I'm proud and honored to be his opening act by request. Couldn't hear a pin drop after that. And then he did his poems. And of course, he went at it from a humorous point of view first, because when cowboy poets first started touring outside of Elko, they really had to be stand-up comedians to make it, which Baxter Black did really well. But Waddy did a lot of serious stuff. So I said, Waddy, you got to do your funny stuff first, or else they're not going to listen. So he got their attention, he got them laughing, and then he did some of the serious stuff. And then cowboy poetry was in at Westfest from then on. And then they started inviting cowboy poets to Cheyenne Frontier Days, San Antonio Livestock Show, the Houston Livestock Show, and if I can ever say there's anything that I'm more proud of than anything else, it's that I got that done by inviting cowboy poets out of Elko into a big public setting so that they could have careers. If I'm going to brag about anything, I'm going to brag about that. I wrote this song in the 1970s with my songwriting partner, Jack Murphey, who was also keyboard player in my band and the guy who played the piano part on Wildfire. And I wrote several songs about him. We mostly wrote songs about Western stuff, but it was a little bit different kind of thing than doing cowboy music. One of the songs I wanted to do was something about Buffalo Bill and the Wild West show. Now, you know, I've talked pretty seriously today about Buffalo Bill, but there's a comical aspect to it too, and he was in show business. He was an operator too. He was a PR guy, brilliant PR guy. Did a lot of brilliant stuff, but he was still a hype artist. So this has got a little bit of that in it too. In fact, it's got a lot of that in it. War paint and feathers, ice cream and cake, Navajo blankets and poisonous snakes, sharpshooting cowgirls on a trick riding spree. It's the god dangest thing that you ever did see. Now all the kids holler from the bandstand for an autographed picture of a medicine man, when out comes Annie Oakley with a pearl-handled gun. They say she can outshoot anyone. It's a Wild West show. It's a Wild West show. It's a Wild West show. They got real buffalo in the Wild West show. Cowboys and Indians must be making the news. They're printing up a lot of tickets and they're writing reviews. They're making $1 million, there's no one to blame. The critics don't like it, so everybody came in the Wild West show. To the Wild West show. To the Wild West show. They got real buffalo in the Wild West show. Now they say in the papers that they've got sitting bull, and it just ain't no telling what that engine might pull. So save up your money and maybe we'll go. Maybe we'll stay for the whole damn show. Buffalo Bill comes out in real buckskin pants. He rides a white stallion while the Indians dance. They whoop and they holler and they shoot off their blanks. Old Bill must be laughing all the way to the bank. It's a Wild West show. Woo-hoo. It's a Wild West show. It's a Wild West show. Yeah, yes. They got real buffalo at the Wild West show. Woo-hoo-hoo. Now it's just like the real thing, although it ain't real. The Indians play dead, it's part of the deal. Spectators ogle and stare Google-eyed. It's sweeping the country, it's gone nationwide. It's a Wild West show. It's a Wild West show. Woo-hoo. It's a Wild West show. They got real buffalo at the Wild West show. And that's been my life. It's always been a little bit of mix-up of fantasy, a little bit of phony stuff, and a little bit of real stuff. And by the time you get to my age, you just got to go with it all.
right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to let you know that Michael Martin Murphey is bringing back his American Westfest this July 4th weekend in Red River, New Mexico. The dates are July 4th through the 8th, and I will be there performing on July 7th and 8th, and I hope to see you there. You can find out more information and buy tickets at AmericanWestfest.com. I'd like to thank Michael Martin Murphey for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Murphy at michaelmartinmurphy.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.